Ever wondered how medieval serfs survived daily struggles that would absolutely break modern people? Historical records reveal 15 brutal hardships that defined serf life, from waking at 3 a.m. to backbreaking labor, crushing taxes, and legal powerlessness. These weren't temporary difficulties, but lifelong burdens that would mentally and physically destroy today's humans. Ready to discover why serf life was humanity's ultimate survival test? 1. Dawn awakening. Medieval serfs began each day at 3 a.m. regardless of weather, season, or physical condition. Unlike modern alarms that we can snooze, serfs relied on roosters and internal clocks developed through years of brutal routine. Missing dawn meant losing precious daylight hours needed for survival tasks. Contemporary records show serfs working 16-hour days during harvest season, with no concept of weekends or vacation time. This relentless schedule continued from childhood until death, creating chronic exhaustion that modern humans couldn't endure. Point 2. Starvation. Diet. Serfs survived on monotonous meals that would horrify modern nutritionists. Breakfast consisted of thin gruel made from barley and water, sometimes with bits of stale bread. Lunch was often the same gruel, with added weeds or vegetable scraps. Dinner featured coarse brown bread and watery ale that barely qualified as food. Meat appeared only during religious festivals or when animals died naturally. Village chronicles describe serfs eating tree bark, acorns, and grass during famines. Modern attempts to recreate medieval serf diets caused severe malnutrition within weeks, proving these eating patterns were survival, not nutrition. 3. Crushing labor. Every serf owed their lord 3 days of unpaid labor weekly, but reality was far harsher. Manor records show serfs working lords' land during critical periods like planting and harvest, when their own crops also needed attention. They plowed fields with primitive tools, harvested grain with hand sickles, and hauled heavy loads without mechanical assistance. The genius of this system trapped serfs in perpetual disadvantage. When lords' crops needed harvesting, so did theirs. But lords' work took precedence. Surviving accounts describe serfs collapsing from exhaustion, developing permanent back injuries, and aging rapidly from physical strain. Tasks included road building, forest clearing, and maintaining lords' property. Women performed equally demanding work while managing households and children. Modern laborers would quit within days facing such conditions. 4. Housing. Nightmare. Serf homes were barely suitable for animals, let alone human families. Most consisted of single rooms measuring 12 by 15 feet, housing entire families plus livestock during winter months. Walls were made from wattle and daub, woven twigs covered with mud and animal dung that cracked constantly, letting in cold rain and vermin. Excavations reveal floors were packed dirt, covered with straw that quickly became contaminated with human and animal waste. Roofs were thatched with reeds that leaked perpetually and required constant repair. No chimneys existed. Smoke from central fires escaped through roof holes, creating permanent respiratory problems. Furniture was non-existent, except for wooden chests storing bedding and tools. Different weather conditions offered varying miseries. Winter brought freezing temperatures with no heating beyond small fires. Summer created stifling conditions with no ventilation. Disease spread rapidly in cramped quarters where families slept together on straw mattresses infested with fleas, lice, and bedbugs. Modern health inspectors would condemn these structures immediately. 5. Disease. Nightmare. Medieval serfs lived in constant fear of diseases that modern medicine prevents easily.
Hot showers.
Without proper sanitation, clean water, or medical knowledge, illnesses spread like wildfire through serf communities. Common ailments included dysentery from contaminated food, tuberculosis from overcrowded living conditions, and skin diseases from poor hygiene. Childhood mortality reached 50%. Half of all serf children died before their first birthday. Those who survived faced malnutrition-related problems like stunted growth, blindness from vitamin deficiency, and dental decay from poor diet. Workplace injuries were common and often fatal since serfs lacked medical care. The genius of disease. Transmission in serf communities was unstoppable. Shared living spaces with animals, contaminated water sources, and complete absence of quarantine procedures created perfect breeding grounds for epidemics. Plague outbreaks could wipe out entire villages within weeks. Village burial records show families losing multiple children to preventable diseases. Contemporary medical understanding was limited to herbal remedies and prayer, leaving serfs defenseless against conditions that modern antibiotics cure quickly. Even minor cuts could become infected and lead to death. 6. Legal. Powerlessness. Serfs existed in legal limbo, worse than slavery. They owned nothing, controlled nothing, and had no rights modern humans recognize as basic. They couldn't leave their lord's land without permission, couldn't marry without approval, and couldn't defend themselves against accusations from free people. Manner. Court records reveal the devastating scope of serf powerlessness. Lords could increase work requirements arbitrarily, impose new taxes without justification, and punish serfs for imaginary crimes. Appeals were impossible since lords controlled the courts. Even serfs' children belonged to the lord, who could separate families or sell children to other manors. The technique involved systematic dehumanization. Serfs were considered property that transferred with land sales. Legal documents describe serfs being sold with the estate like livestock. They couldn't own property, testify against free people in court, or seek justice for crimes committed against them. Castle archives show lords exploiting this powerlessness. Routinely, serfs who complained faced additional punishments. Those who tried escaping risked brutal punishment if caught. Medieval law codes specifically excluded serfs from protections guaranteed to free people, creating a permanent underclass trapped by legal structures. 7. Crushing taxes. Serfs faced an overwhelming burden of taxes, fees, and obligations that consumed most of their production. Beyond the basic requirement of working lords' land 3 days weekly, they owed additional payments that made survival nearly impossible. Manor account books reveal the staggering scope of serf financial obligations. Primary taxes included giving 1/3 of their grain harvest to the lord, paying church tithes of 10% to local priests, and surrendering their best animal when family heads died. Marriage required expensive licenses. Serfs paid fees to marry, additional charges if spouses came from other manors, and ongoing taxes for any children produced. The genius lay in creating inescapable debt cycles. Serfs needed lords' permission to use mills for grinding grain, but usage required payment. They paid fees to pasture animals on common land, to gather firewood from forests, even to repair their own homes. Market transactions required sales taxes paid to lords. Excavated household remains show the devastating impact. Serf households kept minimal possessions because surplus production went to authorities. Failed harvests created impossible situations, where serfs chose between paying taxes and feeding families. Medieval manuscripts document families selling children to meet tax obligations, proving the system's brutality. 8. Physical punishment. Medieval justice for serfs involved public punishments, designed to humiliate and terrorize communities into submission. Lords' bailiffs administered beatings for minor infractions, like arriving late to work, damaging tools, or showing disrespect to authority figures. Court records describe horrific punishment methods that would constitute torture by modern standards. Serfs were flogged with leather whips for stealing food during famines, placed in wooden stocks for days as public entertainment, and subjected to mutilation for serious crimes. The pillory exposed serfs to crowd abuse while restraining their heads and hands. The technique involved psychological warfare through public spectacle. Punishments occurred in village centers where entire communities witnessed the consequences of disobedience. Branded criminals carried permanent marks identifying their crimes, ensuring lifelong shame and reduced social status. Different offenses carried varying punishments. Theft resulted in hand amputation. Adultery brought public whipping, and attempted escape led to branding or ear removal. Administrative records show lords using punishment frequency to control serf behavior through fear. Surviving testimonies describe the lasting trauma these public displays created in serf communities. Children witnessed extreme violence regularly, normalizing brutality and reinforcing social hierarchies. Modern psychologists studying these records identify clear patterns of systematic psychological abuse designed to break human dignity and resistance. 9. Water contamination. Access to clean drinking water was a daily struggle that medieval serfs never solved satisfactorily. Wells were contaminated by human and animal waste. Streams carried diseases from upstream communities, and storage methods bred dangerous bacteria. Hydration meant choosing between thirst and illness. Village records show water sources shared between humans and livestock, creating constant contamination cycles. Serfs drew water from ponds where animals drank and defecated, leading to cholera, dysentery, and parasitic infections that killed thousands annually. Rain collection was limited by lack of proper containers or storage facilities. The genius of medieval water problems was their interconnected nature: poor sanitation, contaminated sources, which spread diseases, which weakened communities, which reduced their ability to maintain clean water systems. Settlement studies show cesspits located dangerously close to wells, guaranteeing contamination. Different seasonal conditions offered varying water crises: spring flooding, mixed sewage with drinking supplies; summer droughts, concentrated toxins; in remaining water, winter freezing eliminated access entirely. Beer became safer than water because brewing processes killed some bacteria, but alcohol content remained minimal. Contemporary understanding of water treatment was non-existent. Serfs had no concept of boiling water for purification, filtering systems, or bacterial contamination. Medical knowledge attributed illness to bad air rather than contaminated water, preventing effective solutions to ongoing health crises. 10. Backbreaking agriculture. Medieval farming required physical labor that would hospitalize modern people within hours. Serfs used primitive tools, wooden plows pulled by oxen, hand sickles for harvesting, and flails for threshing grain. Every aspect of agriculture demanded extreme physical exertion that continued from dawn to dusk. Plowing involved walking behind animals for miles daily, guiding heavy wooden implements through rocky soil. Harvesting required hours of bent-over work, cutting grain stalks individually with sharp tools. Threshing meant beating grain with wooden flails for hours to separate kernels from stalks. Carrying grain to storage areas involved hauling heavy sacks without mechanical assistance. The technique demanded specialized knowledge passed down through generations: when to plant different crops, how to predict weather patterns, which fields needed rest periods. Mistakes meant starvation, since serfs couldn't purchase food elsewhere. Medieval agricultural manuals described the exhausting seasonal cycles that governed serf existence. Different crops required varying labor intensities. Wheat needed careful timing for planting and harvest. Barley required specific soil preparation. Oats demanded immediate processing after cutting. Manor records show serfs working their own plots at night after completing lord's requirements, creating impossible schedules. Skeletal analysis reveals the physical toll: severe arthritis, spinal damage, and repetitive stress injuries that began in teenage years. Modern agricultural workers using machinery accomplish more in hours than medieval serfs achieved in weeks of brutal manual labor. 11. Social isolation. Serfs lived in crushing social isolation that would destroy modern mental health within months. Bound to specific manors, they couldn't travel, visit relatives in other villages, or experience life beyond their immediate surroundings. Social mobility was impossible. Serfs remained serfs from birth to death. Marriage options were limited to other serfs within the same manor or required expensive permissions to marry outside the community. This created inbreeding problems and reduced genetic diversity that contributed to health issues. Families were separated when lords sold portions of estates, with no legal recourse for maintaining relationships. The genius of serf isolation was its completeness. Physical restrictions prevented travel. Economic limitations eliminated leisure time, and legal barriers blocked social advancement. Population studies show villages with populations under 100 people, creating tiny social circles with no escape. Different social restrictions offered varying impacts. Religious obligations required church attendance, but limited interaction with higher social classes. Market days provided brief community contact, but under heavy supervision. Seasonal festivals allowed celebration, but reinforced social hierarchies through assigned roles. Personal accounts describe the psychological impact of permanent social stagnation. Serfs knew they would never improve their circumstances, never see distant places, never escape their predetermined social roles. This hopelessness created depression and resignation that medieval records describe as common serf characteristics. Modern psychology recognizes these conditions as symptoms of systematic oppression, designed to prevent social resistance through learned helplessness. 12. Constant hunger. Medieval serfs experienced hunger as a daily reality that modern people cannot comprehend. Even during good harvest years, serf families ate just enough to maintain basic function, with chronic malnutrition affecting every aspect of life. Food security was a constant anxiety that influenced every decision. Serf diet consisted primarily, of course, bread made from barley, oats, or rye, grains considered fit only for animals by wealthy classes. Vegetable pottage provided some nutrition, but lacked essential proteins and vitamins. Meat was so rare that many serfs went months without tasting it, except during religious festivals when lords provided communal meals. The technique of food distribution ensured serf hunger after giving portions to lords, paying church tithes, and setting aside seed for next year's planting. Little remained for consumption. Bone analysis of serf remains shows clear signs of malnutrition, including stunted growth, dental problems, and bone deformities. Different seasons brought varying hunger levels. Spring was traditionally the hungriest time as stored food ran low. Before new crops matured, summer offered temporary relief through wild plants and vegetables. Autumn provided brief abundance before winter scarcity returned. The hunger gap between old and new harvests lasted months. Administrative records document families eating tree bark, grass, and even dirt during famine years. Children showing signs of severe malnutrition were common sights in serf communities. Modern nutritional analysis suggests medieval serfs consumed 30 to 40% fewer calories than minimum requirements for healthy adult function, creating permanent weakness and shortened lifespans. 13. Weather exposure. Medieval serfs had no protection from weather extremes that modern humans avoid easily. Working outdoors regardless of conditions, they faced frostbite in winter, heat stroke in summer, and constant exposure to rain that soaked through inadequate clothing and shelter. Winter work continued. Despite freezing temperatures, animals needed feeding, repairs couldn't wait, and lords demanded completion of assigned tasks regardless of weather. Serfs wore thin woolen garments that provided minimal insulation and wooden shoes that offered no protection from snow and ice. Frostbite and hypothermia were common winter casualties. Summer brought different challenges as serfs worked in fields. Under blazing sun with no shade or rest periods, dehydration and heat exhaustion claimed lives during intense harvest periods when stopping work meant losing crops. Inadequate clothing offered no protection from sun exposure, causing skin damage and cancer. The genius of weather vulnerability was its inescapability. Serfs couldn't afford weather-appropriate clothing, couldn't modify work schedules for comfort, and couldn't seek shelter when conditions became dangerous. Medical records show weather-related injuries and deaths as regular occurrences in serf communities. Different weather patterns created varying survival challenges. Extended winter cold killed weaker community members. Summer droughts destroyed crops and increased hunger. Spring flooding ruined planted fields and contaminated water supplies. Autumn storms damaged harvests and reduced food security. Historical accounts describe serfs continuing work despite illness, injury, and extreme, whether because stopping meant punishment from lords or failure to complete survival tasks. Modern safety regulations would prohibit the working conditions that serfs endured daily throughout their lives. 14. Childbirth dangers. Medieval serf women faced childbirth as a potentially fatal experience that claimed lives regularly throughout communities without medical knowledge, proper sanitation, or skilled assistance. Pregnancy and delivery were survival challenges that modern women cannot imagine. Maternal mortality rates reached 20%. 1 in 5 serf women died during or shortly after childbirth. Those who survived often suffered permanent injuries, including torn tissues, infections, and chronic pain that lasted lifetimes. Multiple pregnancies compounded these risks as women's bodies never fully recovered between births. The technique of medieval childbirth involved dangerous practices that increased rather than reduced risks. Midwives used dirty hands and contaminated tools, believing that washing was unnecessary or harmful. Delivery positions and methods often caused additional trauma to mothers and babies. Infant mortality was equally devastating. 50% of serf babies died within their first year. Those who survived faced immediate challenges, including inadequate nutrition, exposure to diseases, and dangerous living conditions that claimed more lives during early childhood years. Village records show the emotional toll of constant pregnancy losses on serf families. Women who lost multiple children often developed severe depression and anxiety that medieval society couldn't address. The cycle of pregnancy, loss, and grief repeated throughout women's reproductive years without support systems. Burial site analysis reveals the physical impact of repeated childbearing on serf women's remains, damaged pelvic bones, nutritional deficiencies from supporting multiple pregnancies while malnourished, and shortened lifespans compared to men who didn't face childbirth risks. Contemporary medical understanding attributed complications to supernatural causes, rather than preventable factors, ensuring that dangerous practices continued unchanged for generations. 15. Early death. Medieval serfs faced average lifespans of 25 to 30 years. That made planning for old age irrelevant. Those few who survived to middle age were considered ancient by their communities and faced declining health without medical care or family support systems. Death could strike at any moment through disease, accident, starvation, or violence. Burial records show serfs dying from conditions that modern medicine treats easily: infections from minor cuts, respiratory illnesses from poor living conditions, and malnutrition-related diseases that weakened immune systems progressively. The genius of serf mortality was its unpredictability combined with inevitability. Families never knew which members would survive seasonal illnesses, workplace accidents, or food shortages. This uncertainty created constant anxiety and prevented long-term planning or emotional investment in future outcomes. Different age groups faced varying mortality risks. Infants died from disease and malnutrition. Children succumbed to accidents. And epidemics. Adults faced workplace injuries and childbirth complications. Elderly suffered from cumulative effects of lifelong hardship without medical intervention. Manor inheritance records reveal the devastating impact of early death on serf families. When parents died young, children became orphans with no social safety net, often dying themselves or being absorbed into other struggling households. Economic productivity was constantly disrupted by deaths of working-age adults. Cemetery studies show the brutal toll of serf life through skeletal analysis. Signs of chronic malnutrition, repeated injuries, infectious diseases, and premature aging that created biological ages far exceeding chronological years. Historical chronicles describe death as an expected companion in serf communities rather than a rare tragedy. Families developed emotional detachment as survival mechanisms, knowing that strong attachments to individuals likely to die young created unbearable psychological pain that interfered with daily survival requirements. Historical context. Medieval serfdom represented humanity's most systematic form of legal oppression, trapping millions in conditions that combined the worst aspects of slavery with the false promise of protection. Legal documents reveal that serfdom emerged from the collapse of Roman imperial structures, as desperate populations traded freedom for survival. During Europe's chaotic transformation, the genius of serfdom was its apparent legitimacy. Unlike slavery, it was presented as mutual obligation where lords provided protection in exchange for labor. This ideological framework justified systematic exploitation that lasted for centuries across Europe. Village records show that serfdom wasn't temporary hardship but institutionalized suffering designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimum survival resources. Medieval treatises revealed that lords understood exactly how much pressure serfs could endure before death or rebellion, carefully calibrating exploitation to maintain productive populations. While preventing organized resistance through systematic dehumanization, modern perspective contemporary humans cannot comprehend the daily reality of serf existence, because modern life has eliminated every struggle that defined medieval survival. Basic necessities we take for granted: clean water, adequate food, medical care, legal rights, and personal freedom were luxuries completely beyond serf reach. Psychological research shows that modern people experiencing even brief periods without these essentials develop severe mental health problems, including depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. Medieval serfs endured these conditions from birth to death, without any concept that alternatives existed. The technique of serf survival required mental adaptations that modern psychology recognizes as trauma responses, emotional numbing, learned helplessness, and acceptance of abuse as normal. These psychological changes were necessary for survival, but created human beings fundamentally different from contemporary people in their expectations and emotional capacity.